Good morning, everyone. Please come in. I know we have several classes joining us, and so we have seats for all of you in our beautifully renovated Cultural Center Theater. My name is Meena Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency in the Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs. And I believe all of the classes that are joining us today, which I will recognize in a moment, are in the Kalikow School. We are delighted to welcome students, faculty, administrators, and guests today. Thank you for taking the time to join us for our panel on Appraising Trump's Foreign Policy and the Future of the International System. On October 1st, it is a day where I think a lot of the focus is on domestic politics, and so perhaps it will be an interesting shift to focus on the international system, though I think many of us who study both areas know the domestic influences on foreign policy can be significant, and hopeful that we will address all of those topics. Truly delighted to welcome everyone here, and particularly Dr. Fritz's International Politics class. I see Dr. Parati was here, American Politics, and Dr. Lippencott's Geography and Global Studies students. We're so glad to have all of you join us today, and everyone else in the audience as well. Thank you, Dean Badowska from Liberal Arts and Sciences, for taking the time to join us. My role is actually going to be very brief here. I'm going to introduce my colleague and department chair, Dr. Paul Fritz in Political Science, who will introduce our distinguished speakers, and then we'll lead a panel conversation. Dr. Fritz told me to keep his introduction very brief. In fact, I think he wants me to stop right now. But I would be remiss if I didn't recognize what all of us know about Dr. Fritz's exceptional leadership, teaching, and mentorship. I'm sure. Thank you. I'm sure it is no surprise that Dr. Fritz has been recognized at Hofstra as Mentor of the Year and as Teacher of the Year in the Kalikow School. And there's an article in the Chronicle that you can Google, as I did, and I'm not going to read it all to you because that would take a lot of time. But 2 points really stood out to me that I've seen in Dr. Fritz's teaching and engagement in the university community and his scholarship. He focuses on the importance of having people speak their minds, the importance of free speech and being comfortable about sharing thoughts and ideas, however uncomfortable they may be, and a high level of empathy to recognize that processing conflicting information can be, as he said, confusing and overwhelming, and recognizing that we all may struggle is important, and says, I'm here to figure out ways to help them. And that's what we will be doing in this panel. I can't think of a better model for leadership, for teaching, and leadership generally. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fritz, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Bose. As usual, you're way too generous and kind. And I'm very happy to have you on this panel, too. And I will tell the audience a little bit about your background and why you're so important in this panel. But I do want to introduce our guest speakers today. As soon as Trump won re-election, I knew we would have to do a panel on Trump 2.0 and foreign policy, given the massive issues that came up in the first round and what was promised in the second. There was no doubt that there would be many issues to discuss, as a polite way to put it. And at the same time, I had been reading Dr. Cooley and Dr. Nexon's work, and I couldn't think of two people better positioned to be able to think both about foreign policy in the United States and President Trump's role, as well as the future of the international system, as the title of this talk talks about. So let me introduce our two guests so that you learn more about them. Dr. Alexander Cooley is the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University. From 2015 to 2021, he served as the 15th director of the Columbia University's Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe, and from 2022 until 25 as the vice provost for research and academic centers at Barnard College. Professor Cooley's research examines how international actors have influenced the governance, sovereignty, and security of the post-communist states. In addition to his books and academic publications, Professor Cooley's commentaries have appeared in Foreign Affairs, New York Times, The Washington Post, and he's testified before the US Congress, the UK Parliament, and the Parliament of Canada. His most recent book, Dictating the Agenda, The Authoritarian Resurgence in World Politics, was published this year by Oxford University Press. Dan Nexon is a professor at the School of Foreign Service and Government Department at Georgetown University. Dan has held fellowships at Stanford Center for the for International Security and Cooperation and at The Ohio State University's Mershon Center for International Studies, where I first met Dan nearly 20 years ago. In 2009 to 2010, he worked as the U.S. Department of State as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, and he was, for 4 years, the lead editor of International Studies Quarterly, one of the top journals in the field. Professor Nexon's work covers issues in international relations theory, American foreign policy, power politics, and the politics of religious contention, and the relationship between popular culture and world politics. His book, The Struggle for Power in Early Modern Europe, Religious Conflict, Dynastic Empires, and International Change, published by Princeton University Press, won the International Security Studies section Best Book Award in 2010. He's also been exceptionally active in trying to make some scholarship more public through blogging, through the Duck of Minerva, Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and other outlets. Together, Dr. Nexon and Dr. Cooley published Exit from Hegemony, The Unraveling of American Global Order on Oxford University Press in 2020. This work, along with their series of foreign affairs articles that build from their examination of hegemony and the U.S. role in the world is, like I said before, what led us to invite them to speak here today. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, Dr. Cooley and Dr. Nexon. I do just want to return a little bit of a favor to Dr. Bose, in the sense she's her focus is on American politics and the American presidency, and that's exactly why she adds so much to this panel. Her first book was called Shaping and Signaling Presidential Policy, the National Security Decision-Making of Eisenhower and Kennedy. Her most recent book is on Obama and the enactment of the Affordable Care Act. Published in 2024. She and I have worked together on edited volumes coming from the presidential conferences that are held at Hofstra. And she is the co-author of two very important and influential textbooks on the American government and American presidency. So we're deeply grateful to have your insights on this panel today, Dr. Bose. So, yes. So today for this, we're going to start out with some panel discussion. Dr. Bose and I have a couple questions we want to start by asking our guest. And we'll do that for 45 minutes-ish, and then we're going to open up to Q&A from the audience. So please be thinking of questions. I know my students, I had you read something. I hope you generated lots of questions from that reading, because we will want to hear from you soon. But to get things going, I want to start really with your work from Exit from Hegemony. From my perspective, this is one of the works on hegemony that does the best job of explaining the concept, because it goes so far beyond just power, right? So many theories in international relations just focus on what power is and sort of how this could translate into hegemony. And you break it down and talk about the constituent elements of hegemony, how it works, and other dynamics. And put this squarely in sort of the context of the U.S. and what you argue is the very clear decline of U.S. hegemony, which is a little different than past predicted declines of U.S. hegemony, of which there have been many. So I'm wondering if you can start by telling us a little bit about the concept of hegemony itself, what constituted American hegemony, and why it's in decline.
All right, so I think I'm going to take this for good or for ill. But before I start, Alex and I have been kind of batting back and forth how we should handle a basic fact, which is that both of us in our public writings and personally are very strongly opposed to the Trump administration's foreign policies, particularly the Trump 2.0 foreign policies. I could talk about things that I think were good in the first Trump administration, but I don't have anything to say like that about the second Trump administration. And so the question is, how do we handle that? And we think the best way to do it is to do what I just did, which is just lay it on the table and be clear that we have our biases, that it's hard to separate our biases from our scholarship because they inform each other, and to invite you to push back on things that you disagree with us about, and not to, sort of, if you don't like what we have to say or you think it's too ideological, great, call us on it, and we can discuss it from there. So anyway, so hegemony is one of those terms of art that supposedly derives from a Greek term for a leader of a military alliance from back in the Greek city-state era. And it means a bunch of different things in a bunch of different contexts, but in the context we're talking about, it's largely a synonym for leadership or primacy or whatever you want to call it. But I think the idea is that we see international hegemony whenever an actor or group of actors, states, empires, city-states, religious authorities, use capabilities that they have in domains. In international relations, we're usually talking about economic wealth and military power, to order relations among other actors, or in this case, other states, to try to set the terms of their relations, the rules of the game, in the great Robert Gilpin's words, to allocate status and prestige, like what's honorable behavior, what's bad behavior, who should get stigmatized and for what. And that this flows fundamentally from this asymmetry in capabilities, right? The fact that they just have, for whatever reason, accidentally, as a result of a major power war, they have the kind of concentration of power that allows them to do this. Now, that doesn't mean that in any hegemony, that the hegemon simply does what it wants and everybody else has to follow. The American hegemonic orders were both negotiated. The US clearly got what it wanted most of the time, but it had to negotiate with lots of other states. There's been really good historical work on, say, the post-1945 settlement, which is the sort of origin story of American quote-unquote liberal international order, although it's not really, but we'll start there, that points out that like Latin American states were instrumental in shaping some of the economic policies, for example. So we want to be clear that having that preponderance of power doesn't mean that you always get what you want, and it doesn't mean that the hegemon is just the only game in town. However, in 1945, by various estimates, because all the rest of the industrialized world had had a big war fought on it that had basically destroyed or undermined their industrial base, the United States controlled, by some estimates, 50% of global economic output. It was as I said, the only major industrial. It was already probably the wealthiest country in the world, and then all of its competitors were devastated in the way that the United States wasn't. And so it, along with its allies, used that position to institute a series of bargains, agreements that were essentially designed around theories of why World War II had happened and how we could avoid having it happen again. Moreover, were a response to specific aspects of the Second World War, like genocides, like refugee crises. So there was an effort to both create a system that would be able to absorb shocks, like the Great Depression, reduce the likelihood of great power war as a solution to disagreements, and would institutionalize protections for people that had, as a kind of result of the huge humanitarian crisis and rights violations of the Second World War. It's hard to understate the catastrophe of that conflict. Hundreds of millions dead, genocides that people paid attention to, as opposed to ones that people didn't, and a sort of real crisis of the pre-existing order. And so that bargain more or less rested on three pillars. One of them was kind of commitment to some level of economic openness, what we call economic liberalism. Now, this could be very varied, and over the course of U.S. hegemony, or the U.S. hegemonic period, this started out as being much more kind of a mixed economy, very social democratic in a lot of respects, more trade, but not necessarily the kind of distributed trade we see now, not as much capital mobility, so not much ability to just for rich people to move their money around as we got later. But it was a set of things like but the premise was that we didn't want another Great Depression, so we needed a lender of last resort, which became the International Monetary Fund. We needed currency stability, which was not in supply in the interwar period for a variety of reasons. So we would make the dollar the anchor of the system and then peg the dollar to gold to give it stability. And that you would create a kind of a process, this eventually became the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to try to work against protectionism, because there was a widespread theory that part of the reason why you got the crisis that led to the Second World War and the rise of fascism was a kind of race to the bottom of protectionism in response to the initial shocks of the Great Depression, which the theory was made everything much worse. And so protectionism was associated with hypernationalism, associated with fascism, and was associated with making these crises worse. The second pillar, as I've sort of mentioned, was a kind of political pillar. The sort of maximalist version of this would be that everybody should be a liberal democracy. But really, it was more a minimalist version, that there should be some basic rights, like physical integrity rights, that should be protected, and we should have regimes like the international refugee regime, so that if people were in states that were violating their rights, they would be able to leave and go other places and be protected. Because there was a huge refugee crisis, obviously, before the war, a larger one during the war, and then an enormous one after the war. And there was a recognition that part of what we had to do was mitigate the kinds of harms associated with these kinds of conflicts. And then the third pillar was multilateral governance, and the idea that we needed global governance mechanisms, cooperation among states, in order to mitigate the risks of these kinds of conflicts. And this comes out of a particular interpretation of what happened in the interwar period. So, you'd sort of famously, although it never happened, there's a sort of notion that in the interwar period, there were people who said the League of Nations is the problem, and the problem is that states, the Western democracies aren't behaving power politically enough. And then there were people who said, no, the problem was that the League of Nations didn't have the ability to enforce what it wanted to do, particularly that the United States wasn't in it. And so the solution was then to essentially create a more robust League of Nations that maybe solved some of its problems. And the UN system actually just inherited a lot of the institutional architecture of the League of Nations, which is why the story doesn't really start in 1945. This morphs as the Cold War picks up, and the United States makes a major break from its past practices and engages in overseas security guarantees. We often talk about the interwar period as a period of isolationism, which is misleading because the United States, of course, was actively involved in global economics and in trade and had an overseas empire in the Pacific in which it garrisoned troops and in the Caribbean. And it was not isolationist in the sense that it didn't do things in the world or wasn't engaged in the world. What they were really talking about were security guarantees, particularly to Europe, and this idea that what went wrong is the United States left Europe after the end of the First World War, and that prevented sort of the right constellation of forces to prevent another conflict. There's an underlying strategic logic there, which I have to mention, which is that the United States policymakers essentially decided that that a core U.S. interest was not having a hostile power achieve hegemony in Western Eurasia, that is Europe, and then, although it's a more complicated argument, in the Asia-Pacific, and that the only way to do that was to the United States to make security guarantees, to have entangling relations of the kind that George Washington warned about in his farewell address. So this, of course, gets really kicked up as the Cold War enters, and we get first the Organization of American States and then the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the first two big multilateral security commitments that the United States makes. The politics of this are actually a little bit more complicated. The US really ramps this up after the Chinese cross the Yalu River, and it decides that it needs much more robust defenses, that it can't deter the communist bloc, because obviously it didn't deter China, and that's where you get all these like mini NATOs, like the Central Treaty Organization or the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, many of which only exist on paper, if they exist at all. And this then creates the kind of, is where how we get this, this division, right, where you have the UN system as a kind of remnant of the global cooperation variant of the, that comes out of 45-46, and then you have within that kind of underneath its architecture, in fact, in international legal terms, in accordance with the UN Charter, a series of Cold War alliances and positions that anchor US security policy. And you can imagine the basic impulse is to keep the Soviet Union from being the hostile power that dominates Western Eurasia. This goes on for a long time. The biggest changes are in the 1970s when the whole economic order just stops working. And this is important for our story. It stops working the way that it was supposed to because the United States advantage is temporary, right? As long as it commits to, and it does, help other states develop and get back on their feet, that means a shift in concentration of power away from the United States. You also, of course, have the process of decolonization, which the US ultimately backs in a kind of competitive struggle with the Soviet Union for affiliation and allegiance in what they call the new nations. Decided the writing was on the wall, so they're going to throw Britain and France under the bus, basically, and repositions itself as an anti-colonial power, really plays that up as part of its supposed identity. But this system, the economic system, which was called the Bretton Woods system, kind of looks like it falls apart in the 70s. The U.S. the balance of payments can't be maintained. The U.S. goes off the gold standard, so you start getting floating currencies. And that has a lot of knock-on effects, but essentially the fear is that among people who like US dominance is that the United States is no longer going to be hegemonic in the economy. There's also a general sense that the Soviet Union has proved it can compete. It's durable, it's lasting, Brezhnev, it's stable, right? And so the United States, so this is read in the early 80s as a successful challenge to US dominance that the US is going to have to live with. But the United States actually, and Carla Norloff has been particularly good at demonstrating this, really actually reinscribes the system in the 70s by essentially using a mixture of threatening to withdraw security guarantees, other types of leverage to reinscribe the dollar as a global currency. And in some respects, actually, the dollar becomes more central after the 70s by some arguments than it is in the Bretton Woods system. This is also when we get a really consequential transformation, which is in the United States and the United Kingdom, you get a kind of a rejection by the dominant party of the kind of mixed economy system, the more social democratic order, and the adoption of what we now call neoliberalism, a much more thoroughgoing commitment to open markets, deregulation, the wisdom of, you get the early phases of this which are more universal, or things like independent central banks. And this gets called Thatcherism and Reaganism at the time, but a really kind of assault on the old foundations of the mixed economy welfare states. The reason this matters is that when the Soviet Union unexpectedly collapses in 1991, and the United States goes from having a pure competitor to being the only country left standing, or the only superpower left standing. And it's actually quite dramatic. It's not that the US suddenly becomes a lot more powerful, it's just the Soviet Union goes away and there's nobody else who can globally project power anymore. Plus, you have the Gulf War, where a lot of other great powers realize they don't have the kind of capabilities the United States has, essentially remote strike capabilities, what we now know of, smart guided ordinances, the whole American way of war. This gets showcased in the Gulf War, where it's really still even primitive by today's standards, and everybody in China and France is like, oh my God, we can't do this stuff. And that really gives a kind, and we have to develop it ourselves, and that gives a sort of, adds to this impression of kind of US triumph. Moreover, what we have to remember is that the collapse of the Soviet Union is not just the collapse of a rival great power, it is a collapse of the rival order, right? You have a sort of, ideological competition, sometimes it's more ideological, sometimes it's less, between the US and the Soviet Union about like, what is the future system of humanity? And the universal systems are liberalism, liberal capitalism, democratic capitalism, whatever you want to call it, and Soviet Marxist-Leninism. And when the Soviet Union's gone and its alternative order just goes away. And so suddenly everybody who isn't involved in this or has been involved in this looks around, and the US system looks like the Victoria system. It looks like it's the most, obviously the most prestigious, the only game in town. Plus the United States and its allies, particularly in the G7, they control like, what you said, 80% of nominal GDP? So something like, together as a cartel, have even more relative capability in some respects than the US had at the end of the Second World War. And they kind of get on the same page about pushing a more kind of neoliberal economic order, about extending the order, expanding it, pushing liberal democratization. Not everywhere, because there are countries the US has good relations with, it doesn't want to screw up. But certainly it becomes a kind of backbone of at least what US policy is notionally about. Right? There are a whole bunch of other aspects of the story. The Yugoslavian Civil War convinces everybody that the Europeans can't get their act together on security, that the US has to remain engaged. And so you get this unipolar moment, this period of time in which sort of every great power, every major developed economy is on the same page about pushing aid conditions, anti-corruption efforts, market liberalization, currency liberalization. This is actually how we get the East Asian financial crisis, because the IMF gets over its skis on pushing floating currencies in countries that really don't have the domestic political economy to support it. And this is kind of, the US strides the world like the Colossus. Madeleine Albright says things like, we are the indispensable nation, right? Then this is in some ways magnified when the global war on terror starts, because the United States initially, just kind of steamrollers Afghanistan and then Iraq, and is really calling the shots in a lot of places, and initially leading a fairly robust global coalition, including some of the countries that are now its rivals in anti-terrorism efforts. So our argument was that this was never sustainable. And the basic reason it was never sustainable is the same reason it's always not sustainable, and it's the basic classic explanation in the literature, which is that nobody remains on top forever, and that relative, not absolute economic decline was inevitable, and it had already been happening for a long time. And in this case, we can speak most about the rise of China. But also, in the early 2000s, when oil prices start going up, Russia starts having money again, and they can start playing more of this game as well. And so you start to get already in the 2000s an environment in which there are other aid donors around. Other people can provide some of the goods that the US and the other G7 states have monopolized. And while this isn't like a big break, it does start to give states options. They don't have to just take what the US is selling, they can bargain for it. Before you could bargain for it if you were sitting on large oil reserves or had an important domestic lobby in the United States, but now you can bargain for it just because you can always go to the Chinese, right? We had this whole discourse about rogue donors who are undermining the order at the time, but this is kind of the early stages of what we start to see. And so, that's kind of the story of the next 15 years, is that as China and Russia rises, they start contesting elements of the international order from within, using leverage that they're gaining by supplying hegemonic goods, economic aids, military aids, security guarantees, they have no security guarantees, security assistance to other states. This means that even if they don't intend to undermine US power, they will, just because other states have exit options. But also they decide that they do want to undermine it. And a lot of countries get kind of unhappy with what the US is doing for reasons that are not that shocking. Countries don't necessarily like having their domestic politics dictated to. They don't necessarily like a system that presumes their regimes are illegitimate. They get particularly nervous after the Keller revolutions and then the Arab Spring in Iraq, where you have militarized democracy promotion, which is like, whoa, like we could kind of tolerate this stuff, but these guys are really after us. Like they would really like our regimes to fall, and if we want to protect ourselves, we've got to do things like build alternative institutions and orders that don't have these kinds of political liberalism and protections within them, and we need to do things like contest them in the UN, and we need to, and then we need to sort of get together with like-minded regimes, and we need to also develop our own capabilities. And I'm going to stop now. Exactly. This was much longer. We had decided like a one-sentence version of this, and I realized as we just get going, the problem we always have is that some people in this room know this history really well. but a lot of people don't. But we all do because we grew up with it and we make assumptions. And so that's kind of like, that was just going to happen, right? It was secular. There was nothing the United States could do about this. And the question is how the United States wanted to land. Did it want a soft landing or a hard landing? Did it want to go out in blaze of militarism? Did it want to go out more peacefully? Did it want to double down on its advantages and remain the most powerful country in the world, or at least one of the 2 or 3 most powerful countries in the world? Did it think that this order was still serving its interests? So it did have choices to make there, or its leadership, its parties, its people had a choice to make there. And I would say that we were sort of through Trump 1.0 and Biden, we were kind of like in second gear in terms of acceleration of these processes, like in terms of choices we were making that were actually probably making the decline more precipitous. And right now, I think we've shifted it, from our view, into fourth gear, and really made some decisions that the US wants a very different order than the one that it has promoted in one way or another for a good 80 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll take the question as what we're doing now. If you want.
Oh, should I? Yeah? Okay. So, Alex, I think we kind of set this up already, and thank you, Dan, for that really masterful explanation of getting us from kind of the end of World War I, right, but primarily end of World War II to the present, because it raises, I think, some key points for us to discuss about the Trump presidency, both Trump 1.0 and 2.0, and how and of course the Biden presidency as well, but how in the last decade or last 8 years, the United States has wrestled with its new role with this exit from hegemony and its role in the international order.
Yeah, that's great. So let me actually kick off with a comment about Biden and the defining foreign policy challenge of his time, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 until the war in Gaza erupted. So 2022, for a very brief moment, the Biden people come back, and it does seem like they want to double down on all these elements of American primacy, right? Saying, America is back, global engagement is back, diplomacy is back, and Russia invades Ukraine in February 2022. And the Biden people take some lessons that they learned quite painfully. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, chaotic, ill-managed, really diminishes sort of U.S. status. The allies are left on their own. The optics of it aren't great. Vladimir Putin's paying attention to that, by the way. Also disagreements about different procurements, nuclear submarines, all these kinds of things. Things are seeming a bit unsteady, but the Biden people see what is happening in the amassing of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, and don't particularly believe, the intel community is split, but this idea that they're just going to be military exercises. As soon as Russia invades Ukraine, there is a very effective mobilization of what we call the global liberal cartel, right? All of the allies very swiftly agree to enact sanctions on Russia, right? Including coordination between the Treasury and the European Central Bank. You see you see all the Western corporates pull out of Russia, a stigmatization of Russia. And you see in general this unified Western response. And I think some people in power, I think fair to say, said, well, this is...
We're back, baby.
We're back. We're back. This is U.S. primacy. This is U.S. power. What they don't see as much is that actually, despite a UN vote that overwhelmingly backed Ukraine, most of the world public is quite indifferent to what's happening in Ukraine. And the Russians play around with different messages about what's happening in Ukraine. The initial one is Ukraine's full of Nazis. We're going to denazify that. Now, if you are someone in Cairo or Bangkok, that message about Nazis in Ukraine is not going to land. You're not going to particularly feel one way or the other. But then the Russians start doing something else. They say, no, this war in Ukraine, it's not about Nazis. It's actually about U.S. colonialism. It's about the dollar. It's about them making us slaves. It's about technology. It's about the U.S. being hypocritical, double standards. Putin in his speech even says triple standards. Putin, in his annexation speech in Ukraine, even has a paragraph, right, about gender reassignment surgery. Look it up. What is a paragraph about gender reassignment surgery doing in a speech justifying the annexation of Ukraine? Putin's audience is much bigger in this particular case. So the point is, Putin is making Ukraine about the world order, right? Not just about Ukraine, about all of the things that the world or parts of the world are unhappy with. He does this, I would say, quite successfully, despite the efforts of the Ukrainians. So I set all of this up to then, when Trump comes back into power, the fundamental difference between Trump 1.0 is that this sweeping domestic agenda, right, that Trump has to transform American society, political institutions, expand the power of the presidency, that feeds into foreign policy in a way that it didn't in 1.0. In Trump 1.0, the doctrine that came out was that the US was now part of great power competition, and that we're going to be pragmatic about it. We weren't going to believe in fluffy liberal ideas, but we were going to compete with the Chinese, we were going to compete with the Russians, we were going to be tough, right? That's not what's happening here, and we're going to have a discussion about what the future system. What is happening here is that this domestic agenda now, right, the anti-domestic liberal agenda is now being extended overseas. So what do we have? We have the elimination of foreign aid, right? Foreign aid's a great power resource. All powers engage in foreign aid, right? From Turkey to China to Saudi Arabia, right, to the European Union, to Brazil, they all have foreign aid programs. It's viewed as a power politics program. It's not viewed as sort of charity, right? Gone. We see all these three pillars that Dan mentioned for domestic purposes now turned around 180 degrees. So economic openness, we have Liberation Day, right? The widespread imposition of tariffs at high rates, the formulas that seem arbitrary, that don't seem to favor allies, right, or traditional economic partners, and a real kind of a type of pressuring environment on that. Also, there's very open invocation of strategy. We like being unpredictable. Being predictable is for suckers. We like being unpredictable. That's how you negotiate. That's how you do deals, right? Like that predictability in terms of being committed to economic openness goes out the window. Political liberalism, Trump's been very consistent on this, right? And he said, like, well, we're not innocent ourselves. We're not going to lecture you about human rights. We're not going to lecture you about democracy. In the part of the world I study, post-Soviet Central Asia, they love Trump, right? They love Trump because they appreciate that they're not going to be lectured to about their political systems. They're not going to get lectures on corruption, right? Even if they're sort of under investigation, right? Like, let's do deals, right? Let's do energy. Let's do all these things. So that's sort of the second one, right? This entire kind of apparatus of like, the values agenda. And then third, of course, the withdrawal from multilateral international commitments. But again, a big difference between Trump 1.0. Republicans have traditionally been more skeptical about the UN. I think it's a very legitimate foreign policy debate to have, right? The UN is too bloated, it wastes money, right? It's a talk shop. Sometimes it is just engaged in sort of endless, pointless sort of governance. What has not happened before in any administration, right, is the kind of backing off of commitments to core alliances, right? I'll give you two prominent examples. One is talking about openly the need to annex Greenland, right, from ally Denmark. It's a NATO ally, right? It's territorial integrity. And then talk about Canada being the 51st state. Right? Some may have seemed funny, right? Sort of, oh, this is sort of talk and so forth. But go up to Canada, this has really created a huge backlash politically against the US. So the point is that the respect for sovereignty, other countries' sovereignty, and other partnerships, right, is something that's always been the case before. The big debate under George W. Bush was whether we privileged partnership with the new Europe, as Don Rumsfeld then said, or the old Europe, right? And the Germans and the French, they were furious, right, that the US somehow was sort of viewing new Europe as better at the old Europe. Here, it's not even about that, right? It is about, no, we are making these sovereign claims on alliance before. So what does all this mean? It means that this domestic agenda that we have now, right, this ambitious, transformative agenda is now being projected into foreign policy itself. The two realms, domestic policy and foreign policy, are now fused in the way that they weren't before. Now, you might support them and say, like, well, good. Politics is politics, whether it's local, national, regional, or global, right? We should have that. But just realize that in a bipartisan way, the way international security policy, foreign policy, diplomacy, global governance have been institutionalized before, this is a radical and dramatic break from what happened. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, there's a lot to work with there.
Yeah.
And it leads to questions about what comes next, right? So we have this inevitable decline in capabilities for whatever reason, right? Because of relative, yeah, right. But we also have this mix of domestic priorities feeding into foreign policy that's contributing to the tearing down of the architecture of hegemony. What follows?
Can I just add a piggyback question to that? Because then I think and what follows, and to what degree will political elites versus the general public be able to influence what follows?
Good question. So I think the question what follows is open. I want to hear Dan's predictions, but we also want to hear from you. Like, what do you think is going to follow? The question about political elites is tricky. I think there is a difference between traditional professional establishment elites, career diplomats, career national security officials, upper level officer tier, defense planners, right? People who have dedicated their professional lives into sort of the specialization, right? Clearly there is a process of deinstitutionalization happening, right? And disembedding of the importance of these institutions, right? But does that mean that now we the people are running foreign policy? No, I think we're getting other types of actors who are involved. Mm-hmm. I'll give you one example. Silicon Valley, right? Let me tell you a story, just very quick digression, about 2003 in Russia. I study Russia also, Vladimir Putin. 2003, the most successful businessman in Russia, Khodorkovsky, who had a very functioning, profitable, independent oil company, just had reached a deal to launch a pipeline to China, gets arrested on the tarmac, right? There's different perceptions you can have about him. Was he a good actor, a bad actor, whatever. Here's the point I want to make. The day after his arrest, right, and imprisonment, Putin convenes a meeting with the so-called oligarchs. The oligarchs were all the powerful billionaires who had inherited Soviet enterprises and had transformed them, had privatized them. Fertilizer, aluminum, metals, right, had amassed such wealth that you had such a massive disparity of wealth in Russia. He calls them all over. He says, this is now going to be everyone's fate, right, if you don't give back to the country that gave to you, right? So essentially, they all take loyalty oaths in that meeting. They all pledge to work within the system. None of them now opposes Putin. And just like that, this class that, you know, I went to graduate school in the 1990s. All the books were about lawless Russia, oligarch Russia, private security in Russia, the weakness of the Russian state, gone like that. Why? Because if you're a billionaire, you need the state ultimately, right? You make so much money that your fate is intertwined, right, in state power and rests in state power. And so this to me is the biggest difference between Trump 1.0 is the open involvement of the tech giants, right? Our own class of entrepreneurs in backing, for instance, calling for decrease in regulatory power in the EU, right? As sort of Musk has done, right? As a sort of foreign policy or talking about deregulating safety standards, right, and sort of meta and so forth. So I think that's where we are, and that's an initial analogy that I think we have a group of private sector elites, right, who are now directly driving certain areas of foreign policy that before were institutionalized in other elites. One final example. Everyone realized we're going to bail out Argentina, right? On the one hand, you could say, well, this is clearly an ideological affinity. Trump and the Argentinian president has, there's a natural sort of political ally there and so forth. But we also have American hedge funds that are really vested in Argentina not going under, right? That's sort of like a direct thing. Crypto's another area, right, where we see, again, the crypto lobby, good or bad, if you want to trade crypto, go for it. Second largest contributor after Musk, right, to Trump's reelection campaign. And now we see all of these sort of crypto deals being enacted, especially in the Gulf. So my point being, again, it's not that we don't have influences on the direction of foreign policy. They're just like not where we typically think about or have grown accustomed to thinking that they reside.
Thank you.
No, that's an important point.
Dan, did you want to chime in, or I can reframe it to think about sort of where the international system itself goes to, right? How are other states going to respond to what's going on in the U.S. with this, bringing domestic politics?
I would just add to that as hopefully a footnote, so I won't bore you to death. In the book, we got to the final chapter and we were like, oh, we kind of have to say something about where things are headed, but we don't really know. Because if we could predict those sorts of things, we'd be in a different business and we'd be making lots of money, right? But we sort of said, okay, well, what are the kind of three impulses we can see? Now, remember, this is written at the very tail end of the first Trump administration. And so we say, okay, well, one option would be a kind of great power competition model, like the Trump administration foreign policy apparatus is pushing. That would probably be, broadly speaking, more realpolitik, more flexible alliances, or maybe less committed alliances. But it would be a kind of competitive international system with great powers, sometimes cooperating, right, on areas of mutual interest, and a lot of times competing, right? And that was kind of seemed like a pretty decent wager. We think we talked about the Chinese-U.S. condominium. What's the term people use? Like China-America. I hate that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, the idea that you get something like a cartel of the U.S. and China, if you sort of agree to disagree on some matters, but don't necessarily thwart each other as much, and just kind of let the mutual benefits that go to the right people persist. That's just one of the things that was out there. And the third we said was kind of globalized oligarchy, globalized kleptocracy, the sort of former Soviet unification of the global economy. And this is a scenario in which we still get globalization, even among people who are calling for against globalism, but it's globalization on different terms. It's terms that are more overtly focused on the maintenance of the right elite's wealth, that are more that go back to something that the U.S. and the EU had sort of started to take action on, which was the free flow of offshoring of money, whether it be to Panama or to Delaware or to luxury real estate in Florida or London. And that this sort of system, the amount of money flowing in the system, continued to influence even domestic politics, places like the UK and the US that became kind of self-reinforcing. So not the end of globalism, but a shift in the power and the distribution of globalism, where the parts of globalization that made it difficult to extract rents, like straight-up open trade, went away, but the parts of it that were really good for extracting rents, like capital mobility, persisted. I don't know what's happening on the footnote to what Alex said is that it looks to me right now like that third one is where we're headed.
Yeah. So there's been an interesting, this is also in the realm of domestic and foreign policy. One of the distinctive features of January and February has been a dismantling of what we call the anti-corruption architecture that we have here in the U.S., right? We have really robust anti-corruption laws globally. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right, which bans U.S. companies or any foreign company listed on an American stock market from openly bribing foreign officials, right? Not allowed. And there has been an announcement, Pam Bondi, Attorney General, announced that this will be paused, right, this enforcement. The Treasury Department has announced that the Corporate Transparency Act, which is meant to ascertain who actually owns a company that has been registered in Delaware or in Panama, has also been enforced. And the reason for both of these actions has been to enhance American competitiveness. Interestingly enough, one of the sources of real contention in the first Trump administration, remember Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil, who became Secretary of State. And to me, it was an interesting experiment. Yeah, let's put an experienced global oil guy, right? Pragmatic, hard-hitting, there. And Trump, by accounts of White House meetings, used to get into open arguments with him over the FCPA. He was expecting Tillerson to say, yeah, get rid of it, right? We want to take the oil wherever we go, right? Like, this is just getting in the way of business. Tillerson would always tell him the opposite, though. He would say, Mr. President, having the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act on the book makes my job easier, right? It means that when we are shaken down for bribes, we can say, we are not allowed to do that. Let's think about other ways that we can help your country, right? So this is a big change also in sort of going forward. And part of what we're facing now is whether this kind of global effort against kleptocracy and corruption that was led by the US, right, in support by the UK and some of the European Union, is even going to be a thing now in 1 or 2 years' time, or whether the whole anti-corruption effort just sort of collapses because the US is no longer part of it.
Not only have they stopped enforcing the legislation on corporate transparency that was designed to deal with shell corporations and money laundering, they've announced they're going to delete the database. Right? Again, bipartisan legislation.
I'm sure we're going to move to questions, but if I can just ask one quick question based on your the Foreign Affairs article you had earlier this year titled Trump's Anti-Liberal Order, How America First Undercuts America's Advantage. You write in there that it's time to retire the term, right, the liberal, or the liberal international order,
yeah.
right? And you make a strong case for institutions and how if the United States doesn't engage with institutions, other powers like Russia and China will. They see the merits of building alliances and so forth. Given that the Trump administration, actually both Trump 1.0 and 2.0, but especially now, the speech at the UN last week, kind of the very sharp critique of the UN, a mixed approach to NATO, actually more favorable to NATO in 2.0 than 1.0. Do you anticipate if the United States, if we're in the period that Dan talked about, this great power competition for the next 4 years, and the US is involved or not involved, will the United States be able to re-engage with a different president in 4 years or 8 years? I'm just depending if it's right, or will it be? Will the international system be fundamentally reshaped?
I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way with a couple of examples. So I think part of the bet here is that whether we engage or not, the world needs us. Right? Whether we engage or not, okay, so we don't pay the UN, we don't have a foreign aid arm anymore. The world still needs us. They want to make deals with us, right? I think this is part of the bet. So let me tell you a couple of stories of what happened in Trump 1.0. First story was withdrawal from the World Health Organization during the pandemic, right? It was a thing. WHO is doing all this sort of stuff. We don't agree with it. We're out of here. Who fills in the void at Does the WHO collapse? No. China, right? China fills in the void, and in fact, you get Xi Jinping saying, China's so committed to providing vaccines for everyone in the world, if you do the math, the US has donated 3 times more vaccines globally than China has, right, in the pandemic. But China took all the credit for doing it, right? Because there was a perception that the US sort of withdrew and that it was setting the agenda. Round about the same time, there was this other really obscure international agreement, and Dan and I have written about this, called the United Postal Convention. It was coming up for expiration. This is basically the agreement that's like when you send a postcard to Estonia or Thailand or Uganda, it's going to get there, right? We have an
19th century.
Yeah, we have an international agreement that allows for the transfer of mail. And the Trump people said, you know what, this agreement is dated, it's going to expire, we're going to let it expire.
They weren't entirely wrong that it was dated.
No, they weren't.
Yeah.
They weren't wrong, they were actually right.
Yeah.
And the main thing they wanted China to pay more. China was at the very lowest part of the scale, right? And they say, well, no US, no international postal agreement. And they were right about that, right? In the end, like, you can't have an international postal agreement without the US in terms of just that infrastructure. But you can't have a World Health Organization. And I think the fear I have, or the analytical observation I would make about that, is that they treat all forms of international governance and multilateralism as essentially being the same thing, right? Without thinking through what are the implications of withdrawing for someone from something, right? Is the US truly indispensable, or will everyone just ignore the US, and then are we in a world that other countries are controlling that agenda? And so I think, to me, that's the prior question to think about in terms of, are you able to reconstitute your presence? Are you going back in a world where, you know what, the whole bureaucracy has been selected by China and Saudi Arabia, right? Like, and there's no way back into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think during Trump 1.0, there was this, and I was probably guilty of some of this too, because, you know, if you listen to what Trump said on the campaign trail, the sense that, you know, the US was going to kind of withdraw from everything, right? That NATO was in real jeopardy. And, you know, there are people inside the administration who said NATO, you know, almost pulled out of NATO, for example. But I think what we actually, that was actually kind of a misleading, I mean, he did withdraw from some things, but I think this was kind of a misleading way of thinking about it. It's not that the US is actually pulling out of a lot of stuff. It's that it's disembedding or deinstitutionalizing, which is to say, it's not that the US is actually going to renounce NATO, but it's going to kind of functionally draw down from NATO, and it's going to make security threats against NATO members, and it's going to do things to kind of make the, you know, sort of take the US increasingly kind of out of the alliance equation. And, you know, there's an argument for that. The Europeans are pretty rich. They have pretty good military capacity. It's malapportioned because they've been dependent upon certain US capabilities that they haven't developed on their own. Maybe it's spending it on, you know, command and control instead, you know, all that stuff. But, you know, the more that Europe does that, the less influence the US has in Europe when it wants to, A, either influence European security policy, or B, influence European economic policy. Or influence the status of the dollar, or anything like that. And so I think what we're sort of seeing now, and then on the other side of that, there are these people who are like, oh my God, Trump's doing protectionism, deglobalization, right? It's the end of the free trade regime. And, you know, because whatever you think of the specifics, you know, what Trump did was flagrantly illegal under international law. Like, he was not allowed to do the things he was doing. He violated a whole host of treaties, right? And maybe he was right to do so, right? But he did. And the thing is that he didn't actually cause deglobalization. What happened was that the Canadians and the Europeans and the Japanese, and this started in Trump 1.0, said, you know what, we just got to have to route around the United States, right? It was going to take itself out of this thing, fine. Okay, so I mean, think about, if you're a European perspective, think about these deals. Like, okay, so the United States is, our goods are going to have a 15% tariff, right? Does that, you know, this is how does a victory? Well, what that actually means is that U.S. firms it means that, for one thing, the U.S. is the only country on the planet paying 15 to 20% import duties on all of the components of production of goods that are made here, which means our goods are going to be less competitive internationally. It also, we can get into the details of import substitution policy, but this is basically a recipe for allowing US competitiveness domestically by allowing firms to raise prices and capture more profit, because they don't have to compete with firms that are, because of the artificial raise in prices. This is the whole theory behind this. So that could be good or bad, right? There are reasons to think import substitution wouldn't be a terrible idea, but the point is that it didn't disrupt the global international trading order. It just took the US out of the benefits from it, right? And I think that's kind of what we're seeing on those fronts. And while, yes, the US in a sense, it could reinsert themselves into it, but it's going to be harder. It's going to be on less favorable terms. It's going to be with a lot less trust in the willingness of the US to keep those agreements. And frankly, even if a change in presidents, you'd have to have a major shift in American partisan politics to allow things like new treaties to be ratified. So you can't ratify treaties anymore because you can't get the votes in the Senate. And this actually started under Obama with these non-controversial treaties like basically like, what was the International Disabilities Treaty?
Yeah, that went down.
Yeah, even though it was completely non-controversial at the time, went down because it became a partisan political issue. Right? And so I just don't know if the US has the institutional capacity to re-engage from things. It can't do new deals that are stable and lasting, like new free trade agreements that at this level. So
there's also longer term things to keep an eye on. So one thing to track would be defense contracts. Right? The thing about defensive contracts, they're extremely lucrative and they lock you into certain systems of production. Right? Like whether it is missiles, airplanes, whatever happens is that you make a generational commitment, right? As well as, the servicing that goes behind it and, the informal operations and cooperation and so forth. And we're starting to see the cancellation of quite a few contracts. Now, there's some others that are being picked up, but the question of are allies going to start procuring in other places because they don't view us as credible or dependable or not constitutes a much longer term question than just an administration sort of coming back, right? If they believe that we are not dependable, then their rational calculation is to find someone who is.
And we're already seeing indications of that, although the US continues to have such a technological edge over some of that it's not, the question is what happens with the F-35, for example.
Yep.
Right? There's a great piece that some friends of ours wrote that said basically the F-35, the strike aircraft, that's the US Belt and Road Initiative. that was the US locking a lot of states into a kind of dependency relationship, a US infrastructure of military interoperability and other types of things. And countries are really having second thoughts about this now. Right? Part of it is political backlash, places where Trump is unpopular, but part of it is do we really want to be dependent on the US for our security anymore? And I think there's been a constitutive shift. I don't think that other countries are going, I don't think the Europeans, I don't think Canada is going to just go back to business as usual because once you're vulnerable, again, to shifts in American domestic politics.
Yeah, we'll turn to a student question just a second, but it strikes me that sort of Eikenberry's work on post-war orders, right, that states are able to lock in those advantages as hegemon only in the wake of catastrophe, in that sense. And we're losing this at a time when there might not be this opportunity to step back in. And the credibility, whether it's with the F-35 or China buying soybeans from Kansas and Nebraska, that's changing quickly.
Abe Newman and Henry Farrell, who are two of the smartest people in the United States academia, right? And I don't just say that because Abe's an old friend of mine, but they have a piece, I think it was in Wired. Have you ever heard the term enshittification, right, of the internet? It's Cory Doctorow's term. They basically borrow that analogy to talk about what's happening to U.S. international relations and things like the F-35, that there's a kind of, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's a nice piece to read, and if you understand the internet part of it, it might help you understand kind of one of the fears about what's going on.
Thank you. I have a million other questions, but we need to turn to student questions because I'm sure there are a lot of questions out there too. So students and other members of the audience, please come up to the microphones for your questions. Students do have preference, so someone break the ice, please.
Don't be shy.
All right.
Hi, good afternoon. I just wanted to ask a question. Because you were talking about how in becoming a hegemon, or if something were to happen for the United States to no longer be a hegemon, do you think that given that, would you need another war for that to happen, where the US needs to be like taken over, or not taken over, but needs to be, in a sense, collapse in the type of sense, like where that power needs to be collapsed in order for something else to rise? Or do you think it would have to fall? Do you think it would take something else less than that?
Yeah, good question.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what do you think?
Oh.
Yeah.
Great question.
Kudos.
I personally think I don't really know about that in that sense. I feel, well, I'm basing it more so off of what happened, how we got to the hegemon state, and based off what you guys are saying as well, in which it took more so the end of one war and the end of two wars afterwards, where everything was all said and done and we were still okay, given the fact that the war wasn't fought on our side. But I still feel like even then with the Soviets, they still collapsed regardless of a war through proxy, whereas yes, but without wars and without any like intervention of that sense. But I just wanted to know your opinions on it.
Yeah, I mean, catastrophes, right, offer opportunities for political redefinition and framing, right, making certain things acceptable and certain things unacceptable, right? And I think, in fact, Dan's overview of the post-war system just emphasizes, again, part of what was constructed was trying to get at, like, what had been the sources of this just insanely catastrophic, like, global conflict, right? In the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the social sphere. In the absence of that moment here, I don't think we're going to have the clarity to overcome our own domestic political contestation, right? I don't think the US can function as a hegemon when domestically now it is so contested over what country we're going to be, right? And I think that's the essential difference than we had before. In the previous class with Professor Fritz, we made one observation. You know, the elements of a national power base, right? They include, you know, a strong military with a purpose, right? They, you know, good GDP, good research and development basis, right? Strong sort of institutions, you know, ability to sort of adjudicate, you know, different disputes, right? There's these components of national power. All of these components of national power right now are being contested, right, in a political sort of way. They're either being contested or being sort of transformed, right? And so it's very difficult to think about what kind of world role you want to project, right, when our own institutions are being contested. So we're, in some ways you can say, well, maybe this is a more honest way. It's bad for political science because we used to divide the world up: American politics, comparative politics, international relations, right? You all have to take your distribution requirements. Now, you know, the Americanists and the IR people are talking to each other, right? And the IR people are like, well, let me tell you what's going to come, right, here in American politics. Because we see local politics, national politics, regional politics, and global politics all interacting with one another in a way I think we're not accustomed to. So that's a very long-winded non-answer to your question. But I think absent that kind of catastrophic moment that you can get a consensus, I think the domestic political agendas are so strong that I don't see much potential for, you know, the hegemonic purpose to be reconstituted. That's just me.
Linda.
So I know that we've talked about, or at least in your article about Trump's anti-liberal order, you talked about how his foreign policy is, you know, kind of antithetical to his goals and destroying the international liberal institutions that would allow the United States to maintain its position as a hegemon. So I guess I'm wondering, you know, in terms of his constituents and his supporters, at least when I think about Trump's foreign policy, I know that, you know, there's no true example of true isolationism in the United States, but I almost picture at least what he's describing about pulling out of international organizations and multilateral organizations as more of an isolationist policy. And I guess I just would want to know what you guys think about that.
So I think that's really astute. Obviously, well, I don't know if obviously, but those of you who know some of the history know that America First was the slogan of the people who wanted to stay out of the Second World War. It was actually a fairly ideologically diverse coalition, but the pro-fascists got the upper hand and other people abandoned it, blah, blah, blah. But fundamentally, and this was kind of what got called isolationism, right? This was what, that term was a term that was trying to stigmatize that position, right? So I think that you're right, and so here's like what I say when I'm in full partisan, angry, irate mode, right? So take this with a huge grain of salt, right? So the great power competition framing in Trump 1.0, that existed already. It was in the Quadrennial Defense Review, et cetera, et cetera. It was the way that the Pentagon was thinking about things. That was an effort primarily by Nadia Schladlow to try to take all the stuff Trump was saying and make it legible to the Washington foreign policy blob, right? To basically find a way to slot it into pre-existing categories that people at Brookings or people at CSIS or people at Cato or at AEI would understand, right? But it was never actually anything that Trump gave a shit about, right? It wasn't what he was about, and so it kind of worked because people who were working like in the European Affairs Division of the Pentagon could go and say, don't pay attention to him. See, we're increasing aid to NATO, right? We're still doing this on a mid-level basis. So in essence, the deep state, as it were, although a lot of these people were Republicans.
Yeah, we have an Africa policy, right?
They thwarted that, but I also think Trump didn't really care about a lot of this stuff. So what we're getting now, I think, is in part a little bit unvarnished, and in part, so I like to say, great power competition, lol, right? GPC, lol, right? Like that was ever really what this was about. So I think what we have now is kind of a fusion, and some of this is radicalization that happened during the Biden administration. We have a fusion of what is essentially what I would call reactionary politics. You can call it conservatism, whatever you want, right? This is the kind of this is the heart of what we might call MAGA. Stephen Miller is probably the most visible, most extreme version of this in the administration. And essentially what's kleptocracy and oligarchy. You have people who just want to extract rents from the state, they want to get their cut, they want to be able to take gifts. Trump gets a plane from Qatar, we'll spend billions of dollars to refurbish it, and then we'll hand it over to his library so he can use it for, if he's still alive, the rest of his life. Basically the people who want to do corruption, right? And it's not that things weren't corrupt before, but want to do like really, what we would associate with a former Soviet country, for example. And the former Soviet people would say is unfair, maybe, I don't know. And they're fused, that's an alliance right now, right? And it's an alliance that sort of works because one of the ways that these kinds of kleptocratic rent extraction, one of the terms we're using now is neo-patrimonialism, like the reduction of the state to the personal property of the leader. That strategy that works, the strategy that happened in Russia and in Hungary and in Israel, right, with Netanyahu, that strategy really relied on, it was adaptive, they figured it out. They used right-wing populism as a way of entrenching rule and justifying authoritarian measures that would help them stay in office and continue to extract rents. And I think we got a fusion of that right now. And I think that, so we should not take seriously the GPC stuff. I think just remain engaged. Trump will do deals. There are places we'll use force. Particularly, apparently, we'll destroy fishing boats in the Caribbean or whatever. But fundamentally, the homeland security push, the warrior ethos push, this is about something more like genuine isolationism. And it's about securing the homeland, I think, is code for domestic political crackdown, right?
I would agree.
And interdiction of migrant flows. And we won't probably pull out of NATO, and in fact, we may support Ukraine, which would be awesome in my view, but we will disembed it, right? It will not become sort of a guiding feature of American foreign policy anymore, and allies who can't make good personalist deals with the people in power won't necessarily get treatment that they'd like. I don't know if this arrangement is stable, and I think we're starting to see fractures in MAGA as people are starting to be like, wait a minute, the corruption is not what I signed up for. And I think Epstein's a kind of interesting moment for that because it's tied up with this kind of elite international oligarchy thing that the movement ideologically was opposed to, right? And I'm actually hoping those divisions get bigger, because I think we should all, whatever we think about LGBTQ rights or whatever, right? And I have very strong opinions on this. We should all agree corruption is bad. And I hope those fractures widen, and that would be probably the route, I think, to something like normalcy, or something. We're not going back to whatever new comes after.
Yeah. Thank you.
Does that?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Anthony.
So I had a kind of a combined domestic and foreign policy question. So with the Trump administration's cuts to stuff like cancer research, pulling out of the WHO, do you think that kind of isolates the United States in a way where, like, at one point a lot of countries looked up to their scientific research as top-notch and like health research as, like, cream of the crop? Do you think that kind of makes them a pariah in that sense and makes countries kind of not want to engage with them in scientific research?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it gets at one of the advantages that for a very long time was assumed to be like just a self-evident, very successful model, right? Which is the infrastructure which this great institution is part of a kind of global research, education, higher education, and technology environment where independent private universities still had the infrastructure of support from the government, right, through sort of tech funding.
We should be clear, this was a conscious policy decision after
Yes.
Sputnik.
Yeah.
The U.S. was going to flood universities with money and make them the hub of its basic R&D efforts that the private sector could not support or would not support.
Correct. And a couple of addendums to that. One is that we would take in the world's best students, right? We would openly educate them here, not on the expectation that they would stay here necessarily, but that they would be exposed enough to what we would consider the gold standard of sort of higher education, that they would keep this in mind when they went into leadership or innovation positions over. And we would have a visa regime that would allow innovators to stay, right? Like be able to sort of access and contribute to our high-tech firms and so forth. I think what you're seeing now, belatedly, is sort of the breakdown in the acceptance of the logic of that model, right? I think there are certain interests that actually don't believe in the centrality of universities and that instead would like to see R&D privatized, right? That they be in-house operations where they control the outputs, they control being able to sort of, sell these, to turn a profit on them and so forth. And so you see a growing coalition within Silicon Valley that's actually very supportive, right, of this move to sort of defund R&D in university. I think we've been very slow to realize that. Well, what's the other constituency for it? Because as Dan said, this was a geopolitical move that then we just took as self-evident is part of what we do really well in this country.
And I think we assumed that people in Silicon Valley knew the truth, which was that the modern internet was a government invention, effectively, right? That this was ARPANET, and the U.S. funded basic research that gave us the web, right? And so that they understood that synergistic relationship, that they were essentially monetizing publicly funded projects and then advancing them and refining them. But apparently that's not the case anymore, right?
Yeah.
Well, do you have ideas on why it's so hard to sell the very clear benefits that came, or to advertise the very clear benefits that came from that model? So some of it might just be not knowing about it, right?
People don't believe it. I mean, you're too young to remember this, but Gore, I took the initiative in inventing the internet. He was talking about a very specific bill, and this actually was contested whether he actually was representing that bill correctly, but people mocked it in terms of the internet isn't government, it's like these smart guys in their garages, like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, but it actually was the government. Right? And the reason we have the model we have now is because the US decided to have that model. There were alternative internet models. France was looking at a much more traditional telecoms model, right? This is the intertwining of the state. And so I think for one thing, we've drunk our own Kool-Aid. I also think you have to keep in mind that most of these people aren't really tech people. They're not really programmers, they're venture capitalists, right? And that's a very different political economy. And I'll be frickin' honest here, as I get radicalized and conspiratorial. We have a massive AI bubble right now, right? We have all this money flooding into the AI sector. I lived through the dot-com bubble. My wife worked in a dot-com startup, right? It's very reminiscent of that in the sense that we have all this money flooding in. This is why low interest rates are so important, right? Because you need low interest rates to be able to borrow money cheaply to flood venture capitalists. So venture capitalists to be able to get loans so they can flood these things and then turn them around for money. So you have this huge AI, just enormous amount of money. There's some estimate that all the growth that we have right now, all but like 0.2% of it or 0.9% of it is just AI investment, right? And so you have this, this sector that's eating up a ton of money that needs to justify itself. And the claims made by, and let's be honest, machine learning and LLM for what it can do are really attractive to people who want to destroy the university system or want to get rid of the capacity of the state because, well, maybe we can just have it run an algorithm and we don't have to worry about it anymore, right? And so there's a synergy there that I think is fueling a kind of ideological, is sort of, you have strong economic interest and strong ideologies kind of selling each other a story that they both want to believe, right, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Indigo, please.
So I was just wondering, what do you think the extent, what is the extent that Trump's, I would say, unconventional social media usage affects foreign policy and maybe just like the U.S.'s presence in the international stage? Like, how do you think that?
Yeah, I think it's very effective for Trump, right? I think this is something that he has continued since Trump 1.0, and I think the whole world has become not only accustomed to it, very responsive to it, very concerned about it, right? The sort of power of the spotlight being caught up in a tweet. You don't want to have that happen to you. Trump intuitively understood that. Trump is very good at emotive and personal politics. He is very good at stigmatizing political opponents, right? Constituencies, I mean, whatever it is, right? And he wants that direct power. And this is when we get to part of this argument about disembedding, right? If you get rid of the National Security Council, right, that has to, traditionally sort of brought different perspectives into a particular decision being made of, grand sort of national security or strategic importance, Trump can just go on his instinct, right, on his gut. And so that mode of communication both, I think, enhances him, but I think deters others, and they want to sort of fly under the radar. They do not want to be sort of caught up in a tweet. I have to say, I'll say this very openly, I was struck at this UNGA from different meetings and things, just how out of the way a lot of countries went to sort of explain Trump's own political instincts and things, right? That they were almost sort of accepting of just how effective a communicator he had become, right? And willing to engage with him on his own terms, as opposed to sort of, wait, let's take a step back here before we, label an entire country in this way, or like, accuse someone of treason or so forth. And that also struck me as interesting too. The international acceptance of this as a new mode of governance is one reason that I don't think we're going back and reconstituting ourselves, even if we have a change in regime.
Do you agree that it should be a new mode of governance, the way that he's using it?
I think social science research, and I mean this, business research shows that the most likely way to improve outcomes is to get a diversity of viewpoints in your process. It's not the most efficient way, right? It can be sort of maddening. And in foreign policy, this is why you used to, under the old system, this sort of sense, well, we're going to call out the Egyptians and we'll sell them these weapons, but not others, right? And people are like, well, what is that, right, as a foreign policy output? That's ridiculous, right? Are you criticizing them or not? Are you supporting them or not, right? There's a lot of truth to that. On the other hand, though, right, everyone has blind spots. Everyone has biases, including us, right? And so big biases. And when you're talking about foreign policy, security policy, you really are talking about war and peace. right? We really are talking about people's safety and security and physical integrity rights on the line. And so turning this into a one-person gut or a mode of exercise, right, is extremely dangerous and in my sort of sense, sort of irresponsible.
Let me concretize this in a nonpartisan way. The big mistakes in the Biden administration, and there were some really big mistakes. I mean, the Ukraine thing, I was gobsmacked because I talked to friends and I learned that they never briefed the Brazilians, right? They didn't do the same briefing or anything like it that they did with the Europeans that got on board with any of the major global South actors. They just ignored them, right? Which is not what you do when you are trying to assure people that you care about them and take them seriously and their voice matters and that they're part of, and bring them on board. And then we could talk about Gaza policy for a very long time, but the fundamental thing is that everybody agrees that is experience that knows that happened, that they were massively over-centralized decision-making in the NSC, right? There really was a handful of people driving the show, and on Gaza, it seems to have been Biden, right? I mean, more than anything else. And so it was bad. It contributed to a lot of their mistakes. Obama was known for over-centralizing decision-making, right? This is not a new thing, but it has reached levels now that, I mean, the trend line is negative, and it's now reached a level that's just shocking, right? That the same people are occupying key national security posts. And it is reminiscent of what we see in personalist regimes, where we know bad decision-making happens because nobody wants to tell the leader bad news. This is probably part of what happened with the Ukrainian invasion, right? There's nobody wanted to tell Putin that actually the intelligence reports were wrong, or the Ukrainians weren't all waiting to welcome the Russians as liberators, or that his weird FSB-style strategy that they implemented in the north when they tried to drive to Kiev, that would actually not work. And you probably saw something very similar with more people in the Afghanistan withdrawal. I think you saw something similar in Gaza, where actually people there were a lot of people in the administration who were not happy about the policy, including Harris's national security people, but they were kind of shut out or not listened to in a way that was reminiscent of that. So this is not good.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing. And again, I don't mean this in a partisan way. Genuinely, the U.S. diplomatic corps is or has been the envy of the world, right? When you talk to diplomats overseas, the expertise they have, the training that they have, the way they are able to sort of command a room to understand the issues, to put forward a perspective, right? And that, to me, is a source of power, right? You might say, okay, cool, that just sounds like elites doing elite stuff. Maybe, right? But that is a resource. That is a source of power. So again, the question is, why are we unilaterally, right, just getting rid of these power bases that we've traditionally enjoyed? Yeah.
I know there are more questions. Virginia, I'm sorry, we're going to have to end it here because we're out of time. Maybe you can step up and ask.
We're here.
But I just want to thank the Cultural Center Theater for putting this together. I want to thank Dr. Bose as the director of the Kalikow Center, and especially thank our guests, Alex Cooley and Dan Nexon, for such an insightful
Thank you.
session.
Thanks a lot.